thank you for doing this. I really appreciate this. I mean, I know our group here is excited to kind of tap in a little bit in your expertise, but before we get started, I just got a question. I'm seeing you working out in the middle of a field, deadlifting. And I mean, I think it's cool, but are you dragging that trap bar and all them weights out in the middle of the field every time, or where do you have them stored?
I just roll it out of the barn. I just open the barn door and just kind of, put a plate on each side and roll it out. And that'll be like what I warm up with. And then I just grab some 45s and bring it out as I add weight. So we're here on farm. You might actually be able to see my cows out there.
Yeah, I've seen some pictures.
That's my lake. Yeah.
Are you in Florida?
So it's kind of cool.
Are you still in Florida? Where are you at now?
I'm in Florida. Yeah. In Plant City, Florida. So it's mostly just like, it's not really a city of Plant City. It's just a bunch of farms and cows and things like that. So I'm about 30 minutes away from the university, and we decided just to move out of the city just to have some quiet space out here.
Gotcha. And I know, because your background, you've done a lot of research. You work with the Navy, and then you've done obviously the ketogenic research. Which I know, which university in Florida was it? I can't remember. It's
the University of South Florida College of Medicine. So I teach the medical students and also in the PhD program. And I'm classically trained in neuroscience and physiology, but I got steered into nutrition because it was more effective than the drugs I was studying for seizures. So, and then that led me off into a lot of different directions with the ketogenic diet. Yeah, you've gotten to be one of the authorities, one of the world authorities on ketones and ketosis, and have done a lot. So it's been very interesting. I know you've done some work with some cancer and some of this, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Well, for those who aren't familiar, just give us like a 3-minute summary of your background real quick, so for people that aren't familiar with you. Okay. I did my undergrad in nutrition science and kind of classically trained as a registered dietitian in nutrition science. And then I double majored in biology, and then kind of getting ready for med school. But my undergrad mentor at the time talked me into a PhD program. And it was early 1990s, so decade of the brain. So I got interested in neuroscience, and I did my PhD in neuroscience and physiology, specifically the neural control of autonomic regulation. So the brainstem mechanisms that control sympathetic tone, your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, and also the neurons in the brain that control respiratory rhythm generation, the oxygen sensing and CO2 sensing neurons. So I studied those mechanisms. And that led me to diving physiology, and I got connected with the Navy, specifically the Office of Navy Research, which is part of the Department of Defense. And the big question that they have is oxygen toxicity seizures, which is a limitation for special operations community using a closed circuit rebreather. So we study ways to predict and mitigate oxygen toxicity seizures to enhance the safety and performance of military personnel. And also it's a limitation of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which has about 14 FDA approved applications. And the work I did with the Navy connected me with NASA. So we do some work with NASA on space analog missions, and we work with astronauts. And I was on a mission where I was in saturation in an undersea environment and got to do a lot of cool research with them. And my wife is also involved in that. She runs a lot of the research programs and was also a crew member on Nemo 23, the last Nemo mission. I was actually friends with Victor, the guy that's just launched on Dragon now. So they were communicating right up before the launch on that. So the ketogenic diet connected me with all these communities. So I'd like to emphasize that there's an interest in our government, military, Navy and NASA in optimizing performance and safety using nutrition.
Yeah, I saw that, something about special operators looking at ketogenic diets probably about a year ago. I think that came out. Let me ask you about, just as an aside, as a personal interest, lifting. What kind of lifting background? Because you're throwing around some pretty decent weight out there in the fields. Did you compete in powerlifting and stuff like that, or what's going on with your background?
It was always recreational. Maybe about like 15 years ago. Actually, I connected with Lane Norton, And he more or less kind of coached me into it. We started training together, deadlifting together, lifting together. And he kind of was guiding me in nutrition a little bit, but I had my own thoughts and background. But I took, what worked for me. I actually did a show in South Florida and placed first in heavyweight and took the overall my first show. It was kind of got lucky there. And I wasn't really into bodybuilding that much, but I was more into powerlifting as a means. It was more just a distraction away from my academic life. And I was probably using weights as a therapy because the pressures of academia are pretty high. So it was always, I got interested in it. My brother was a very good athlete through high school and college and stuff. So I got into it probably at age of 14. And I was always very strong as a kid. My brother was always strong. So I was always trying to catch up with my brother. And then I trained with the football players and stuff. I went to Rutgers University and I would compete in like little college level, powerlifting events. But yeah, it was always worked up to some pretty big lifts. And I used to be a bit heavier, like 260, 270, but I stay like about 220 now. And that's a good weight for me. And I've been doing a carnivore ketogenic diet, pretty much mostly carnivore for 12 years now, I would say. And it definitely has not hurt my gains in any way. I don't carry the amount of weight that I did in the past, body weight, but as far as like, lifting and strength, it's definitely has not hurt me removing carbohydrates from my diet.
Yeah, and I think this is a interesting topic because I've talked with Don Lehman, Stu Phillips, Jose Antonio, Jose's down there in Florida, probably not far from you. But all of the guys basically say, look, it's protein and calories. I mean, if you can get protein and sufficient calories, you're going to put on muscle. And I think with the carbohydrates, you retain water, you get maybe a little more puffy and bloated. But as far as actual functional muscle units, my understanding of the science is require that, and that's been pretty interesting. And like I said, I'm fixing to turn 54, and I've been I started when I was about 13, 14 too, so 40 years of this stuff, and still plugging away. And I found that eating a lot of protein, particularly bioavailable proteins that comes in meat, eggs, and so on and so forth, is just tremendously good for putting on muscle and that. Let me ask you about so ketones, ketogenic diet. Now, do ketones themselves, and I know you've done some work on exogenous ketones, what is it? I mean, just overall benefit or specific benefits, or is it the process of going into ketosis, which is really where the money is? I mean, what would you say, having done this for now many, many years? Is it what I'm doing to get into ketosis, or is it the ketones themselves, or is there some? I'm sure the answer is there's some hybrid between the two. But what's the perspective on that in 2020?
There is, and I got into this with the understanding that the ketogenic diet causes a metabolic physiological shift. And it's that shift and adaptation of using ketones as an energy source in the brain that confers the neuroprotective anti-seizure effects that I was studying. That's like 2007 or 8. And then I connected with Dr. Richard Veach, who was developing exogenous ketones, because I found some patents and I saw that DARPA was funding research on warfighter performance program. Research was being done at Oxford University, and circumventing the dietary restriction that's typically associated with getting into ketosis and directly just giving ketone esters. The data looked pretty interesting and compelling. So the program officer in the Department of Defense did not like the idea of using a carbohydrate restricted ketogenic diet. So he said, come up with a ketogenic diet and a drug. And I did not think that just delivering ketones as an oral bolus would have any kind of anti-seizure effect. And the first couple we tested did not have any anti-seizure effects, but I worked with Patrick Arnold, who is actually a chemist in the sports science world and developed some interesting compounds. And he actually helped me synthesize a ketone ester that was particularly effective for preventing oxygen toxicity seizures. And I guess it was his initial experiments, maybe 12 years ago, that convinced me that ketones were in and of themselves therapeutic, and from a neuroscience anti-seizure perspective. But the field as a whole, and I just got out of a NIH NINDS workshop, and I'm also presenting at the American Epilepsy Society meeting on. I chair the special interest group in ketogenic diets. It's mostly like a pharmacology sponsored epilepsy conference, but there's over the years, my first time I went to American Epilepsy Society, there was about 30 members in the special interest group, ketogenic diet. Now there's about 200 members. And these are all upper level scientists in academia where we have the discussion, what is the anti-seizure benefits of the ketogenic diet? Is it lowering glucose? Is it suppressing the hormone insulin? Or is it elevating ketones? And I think it's a combination of both, but there is no doubt in my mind that supplying ketones as an alternative energy source to the brain changes the neuropharmacology of the brain in a way that prevents seizures. So it elevates the neurotransmitter GABA. We've measured that. It lowers glutamate, or actually converts more glutamate to GABA. It has an anti-inflammatory effect in the brain. Systemic inflammation goes down. Neuroinflammation goes down. It works through adenosine signaling to reduce hyperexcitability. And it really, from the basic science that we did, it shows that if you put the brain under extreme oxidative stress, like a Navy SEAL would experience in a deep dive using an oxygen rebreather, the ketones help the mitochondria and the neurons continue to make ATP. And it's that ATP, that energy currency in the brain, that helps the neurons maintain their membrane potential. And if that membrane potential collapses, then the cells dump glutamate and it triggers a seizure, right? So what some of the first experiments that I did was basically showing that if you fuel the cells with ketones and hit them with all sorts of toxins, high glutamate, you dump potassium, you dump neurotoxins in there, and we have microscopes inside hyperbaric chambers in our lab. And that was part of my postdoctoral fellowship, was actually building hyperbaric chambers with electrophysiology inside and with microscopes inside. And it was very clear that if the neurons were running off ketones, it conferred major benefits from a bioenergetic point of view. And then I got kind of sick tinkering around with cells. And I was like, let's stick this stuff in animals and see what happens. And then we did a series of studies in rats and mice. And now we're doing pig studies. And now we have human studies at Duke University at their hyperbaric chamber. And it seems this is very translatable. And that's what's great about this diet research, is that with drugs, you get a mixed bag of all sorts of effects. But with the ketogenic diet, it seems to work across the board, across species, and even not just for seizures. It works for cancer, for Alzheimer's disease, for if you just go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in ketone supplements, there are 86 registered clinical trials if you search ketone supplements on clinicaltrials.gov. And just a few years ago, there was nothing. So and these are like Johns Hopkins, Cornell, Mayo Clinic, Duke University. These are major institutes actually studying ketones, not just the ketogenic diet, but actually studying ketones as a therapeutic.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Cahill back, decades ago, where he basically brought people down. And, when you see people have a hypoglycemic, like diabetics, they get hypoglycemic and then they seize because their glucose gets too low. But I think he demonstrated if ketones were in sufficient quantity, you could get your glucose extremely low and still and the brain would work just fine. I want to ask you about, so let's talk about long-term ketosis, because you've been doing, we keep seeing in the sort of the press, I guess, a ketogenic diet is okay short term for weight loss. Beyond that, it's dangerous. Something bad is bound to happen. People talk about, maybe chronic stress due to cortisol levels. What are your thoughts on maintaining ketosis over the long haul? Is it dangerous? Do we have any significant data that supports that?
Well, the best data actually would come from patients that are using it as a metabolic therapy. And this would include patients that have been using it for epilepsy, there's a genetic disease called glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome and pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency syndrome. And in this case, and a number of neurometabolic conditions where the ketogenic diet is the standard of care. So you have groups of people who have been following it for decades, and you can look at their blood work, you can do their carotid scans, you can look at, their liver function, kidney function. There appears to be no atherogenic effects. There appears to be, over the years, I'll say that in the pediatric population, what we saw initially, they were feeding the kids this formula called Keto Cow, and the formula was hydrogenated soybean oil, casein, and then like some aspartame and stuff. And the ratios were 90% fat, mostly from hydrogenated oil. And what they found is that some of the kids, it was pretty high actually, about a four times higher increase in kidney stones. And then they did some follow-up work. As we learned more about hydrogenated fats and different ratios of the ketogenic diet, we bumped up the protein because it was stunting the growth of some of the kids. The diet was like 8% protein, which, really was not enough, but now they've modified it to like 12%. And then they try to switch to more of a modified Atkins or modified ketogenic diet with upwards of 15 to 20% protein. So that actually prevented the side effect of reduced growth, and also just the supplement like potassium citrate, a mineral supplement. And they go back and look at the studies now, and there's no higher incidence of kidney stones. So that was kind of like probably one of the bigger problems. Constipation, there's things like that are usually transient in the beginning, because as your gut microbiome changes and depending on how you formulate the ketogenic diet, what kind of foods you incorporate into it, casein and cheeses and things like that tend to stop people up. But if you adjust and formulate the ketogenic diet appropriately, pretty much all biomarkers of metabolic health improve. And, there's that LDL thing that a lot of people see a spike in LDL, but I'm cautiously optimistic that that's not would significantly contribute to an atherogenic effect. And, over the years, my LDL came down. It did initially spike up. I was on pretty much a high dairy fat diet, and I started switching out some of the saturated fats for monounsaturated fats. And so I don't know if it was a transition of my body sort of just adapting to the ketogenic diet over time, but my LDL went 3 times higher than baseline. And then in about 3 to 4 months, it got down to the upper range of normal. And now it just stays a little bit normal, but my HDL is high. My triglycerides are really low, bottomed out. If I'm fasting, they go down in the 30s. So my body's very hungry for fat in a way that it wasn't before, because my triglycerides are always double or triple that when I had carbohydrates in my diet.
I think one thing that many people don't realize, when it comes to fatty acid profiles in different foods, for instance, pork, red meat, they tend to be higher in monounsaturated fats than saturated fat. If you look at the profile, they're slightly more mono. Whereas dairy, dairy will have a higher saturated fat profile relatively. I wanted to ask, so ketone esters, ketone salts, Simon was asking, when you do studies on animals, cell culture studies looking at the effects on that, is there a run-up period where they have to adapt to being able to utilize those foods, so-called fat adaptation, or is it pretty much immediate?
That's a great question. And that was my concern going into this research, is that my initial protocol was to feed animals ketone esters with the standard diet for 1 week, and then put them inside a hyperbaric chamber, 5 atmospheres of oxygen. We're at 0.2 atmospheres of oxygen now, 20% oxygen. So in a hyperbaric chamber, you flush out all the oxygen, make it 100%, and then increase the barometric pressure to 5 atmospheres. That will give you or me a seizure in about 5 minutes. So it was a very reliable way to trigger a tonic-clonic seizure. And when we gavage, basically tube feeding a rat, I remember putting the first rat in there, and we measure EEG and 14 different channels of data. And we're all standing around, and 60 minutes goes by, and we're looking at it, and the rat is just grooming itself. And this was a rat that was eating a high carbohydrate diet all the way up to the time we dove them. We gave them a dose of ketone ester that would be equivalent to me consuming 60 or 70 grams of pure ketone ester. And in 30 minutes, if you were to pull my blood, it would look like I fasted for about 7 to 10 days. My ketones would be about 6 or 7 millimolar. My glucose would go remarkably down to about 40 milligrams per deciliter to 50, which is like hypoglycemic. And, in that state, we observed a 600% increase in the latency to seizure. And that was without adapting the animal to ketosis. Prior work was done fasting for 36 hours. So in a human, that would be like five days or something like that. And that was protective against oxygen toxicity seizures. So, fasting is not going to work for a warfighter. So, and a ketogenic diet takes a couple days to get into ketosis. So this idea of delivering a ketone ester 30 minutes before a mission operation, was pretty remarkable. And it was like every animal that we dove after that, we published that in 2012 or 13. It worked remarkably well for every animal that we did. And we gave it immediately, 30 minutes before we gavage. It's like a tube feeding. And then we let the animal acclimate to the environment. And then we pressurize. And we've done a lot of studies looking at like anxiety behavior. We've done studies looking at all sorts of different seizure model studies, absence seizures, Angelman syndrome, genetic disorders, and the physiological state of therapeutic ketosis is beneficial from many different, and for high blood glucose too, which is something that we didn't really expect to see. I wasn't really looking for it, but it jumped out at the data. I wasn't studying it, but we measure, metabolism, and we still don't really know why. The blood glucose goes way down when you give ketones. And there's 3 different things that we think might be contributing to that: a decrease in hepatic gluconeogenesis, an increase in insulin sensitivity, and then the third thing would be potentially an insulin-induced release of or a ketone-induced release of insulin. So that's how we actually physiologically regulate our own ketone production. So we go on a ketogenic diet, the ketones get elevated in our blood, and then we have ketonuria. We start peeing them out a little bit. But as ketones get to a certain level, it stimulates the pancreas to release a little bit of insulin. And that decreases beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver, because ketones have an anti-lipolytic effect. And then that will decrease ketone production. It doesn't have to be much. But if I have to take a really massive dose of ketones to get any measurable increase in my insulin. So I'm measuring insulin like every day now. I'm measuring actually on the carnivore diet. I bump my protein up to 200 grams a day, and I wear a CGM device. And surprisingly, I really thought my CGM, it was going to show. And my blood glucose has remained really low, even when eating 1 gram per pound of protein. I mean, way back when I was 20, I would eat 4 or 5 pounds of steak and wash it down with a Metrix with HMB. I don't know if you remember that product, like back in the 1994 or something. I was eating like 500 grams of protein a day. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I mean, I literally I kept journals since I was like 14 years old. I was eating like 400 or 500 grams of protein a day on some day. I was much heavier at the time, probably about 50 pounds heavier, but it didn't seem to harm me in any way. My liver enzymes always ran a little bit high. But, when getting back to the point of ketone supplements, they seem to have effects independent of the ketogenic diet. And many of the beneficial effects are due to elevating ketones in the blood.
I smile because I'm currently probably putting down 400 to 500 grams of protein.
Oh, wow.
Right now at 54. And I check my kidney functions, all perfect. I mean, I'm trying to put some weight back on. I'm trying to get back up 250, 260 and, focus on some strength for a year or so. As I was leaning out the last year, so I'm kind of reversing things. But I wanted to ask you about, so we've got this glucose lowering effect of ketones, and the mechanism is still debated. It's probably, like you said, a combination of numerous things. Is there a therapeutic role? And I have seen a paper written on that for diabetics, looking at adding exogenous ketones does seem to have an effect. Is that a potential therapeutic treatment for diabetes, do you think, or is there maybe some is there potential harm with that? I mean, some people say you're pouring extra energy in and maybe make you fat or something like that. What are your thoughts on using it as a treatment for diabetes? Not the ketogenic diet, but the exogenous ketones. Obviously, the ketogenic diet's been used pretty effectively.
Yeah. Verta Health is doing a lot of work on that front. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in ketone supplement and search type 2 diabetes, you'll find a number of clinical trials actually in progress on type 2 diabetes. And what's interesting is that there's even a clinical trial in progress on type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, I remember my early talks at the epilepsy conferences. It was like, well, if you have type 1 diabetes, don't even think about doing a ketogenic diet because, you run the risk of ketoacidosis. But now Dr. David Ludwig and Dr. Leonards at Harvard Medical School, they're working with my student who's actually, he's a postdoc now, Dr. Andrew Kutnick, who is also a power lifter. He gave a TEDx talk on managing his type 1 diabetes with a low carb, ketogenic diet. And he's garnered a lot of attention for that. So now he's like going all over the world talking about basically just doing carbohydrate restriction to manage type 1 diabetes. So it is very interesting that ketone supplementation is being used in the context of type 1 diabetes. And I think the benefit is that you have tremendous resilience against hypoglycemia in the context of type 1 diabetes. So, I can I've done certain things to push my glucose down into the range where it's not even measurable, right? And I could take a ketone ester and on paper I should be dead. But it was kind of like the early Cahill studies, Oliver Owen and George Cahill in 1967 had subjects where they fasted them for 40 days. And on week 2, I believe they administered 20 IUs of insulin and pushed their glucose down to 1 millimolar. And they were asymptomatic for hypoglycemia, which is remarkable. I mean, we teach to med students, you get down to 2, you go into a coma, and then you die if you don't reverse that. So I think there's a tremendous potential benefit for a therapeutic application of ketones could be to reverse insulin shock and hypoglycemia, because you're basically just giving the brain an alternative energy substrate. In the context of the type 1 diabetes, diabetic ketoacidosis is not really caused by the ketones, but it's caused by a simultaneous elevation of glucose, which because your body does not produce insulin, it doesn't correct. You have a high level of glucose and runaway ketogenesis. If you have no insulin present, you can't regulate ketogenesis in the body. So it's the ketoacidosis is really from the combination of elevation of ketones and runaway and high levels of glucose. So, but if you can manage your type 1 diabetes, with a carbohydrate restricted diet, whenever you're using less insulin, any endocrinologist would have to agree with you that is the better dietary approach. Whatever dietary approach allows you to decrease glycemic variability and maintain it within a target range and reduce your insulin. And a ketogenic diet and a carnivore diet would be I don't know of any other way to achieve that goal more effectively than that. So I think now you have top tier endocrinologists and diabetes researchers realizing it and actually doing the clinical trials now. That was unheard of. Like 5 years ago, people would have thought you were crazy if you did that. But now you have registered clinical trials looking at this.
That's great to hear. And I just anecdotally, we've got members in this community that are type 1 diabetics, and they're literally on a whisper of insulin. I mean, their hemoglobin A1C is 4.8, 4.3, 4.6. Wow. I mean, these guys, there's a few people who claim they've come off all insulin, which is sort of interesting to see if that's actually true or not. But interesting probably, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Louis Newberg from the early 1920s, University of Michigan. This is right before the invention of insulin. And what he was doing was, he was basically doing the desugarization process with these really, really sick type 1 diabetics that were coming in emaciated, infected, almost on this verge of septic shock. And he was basically putting them on a 90% fat diet. He was limiting their protein at the time, but he got I mean, one of the things, they reliably dropped their sugar in a normal range, or at least they weren't having, sugar in their urine anymore, glycosuria. But more interesting to me was none of them were experiencing hypoglycemia, whereas some of the other protocols of the time, hypoglycemia was a particularly interesting thing. So I think that higher fat approach does seem to have an effect on protecting you from that hypoglycemia. And we've got, there's Becky here in our group. She's on a high fat carnivore diet, and she routinely will show blood glucose in the 40s and 50s, totally fine. And there's other people, people freaking out. You got to get to an ER. And I'm like, look, it's a symptom based, issue for a lot of people. It's not to say that hypoglycemia isn't a serious problem, but like you say, you can be low, much lower than what the standard reference ranges are, and be completely fine, not at risk, depending on what else is going on. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it was life-saving for them back then, right? Prior to insulin being able to be produced. Yeah.
They were, otherwise they starved to death.
Well, I'll say my student, Andrew Kutnick, who he was a PhD student, he's a postdoc now, he had some pretty close calls. And then only after working in the lab did he fully adopt and embrace a low carb ketogenic diet. But he was always chasing his glucose with insulin and things. And there was a couple really close calls where he was going into a coma, and we kind of caught him. And then he changed his diet, his hemoglobin A1C improved dramatically. He has, in his TEDx talk, he shows his CGM before and after, a ketogenic diet, and it's remarkable. And so I think this is a no-brainer. This is this is life-saving information, and it's great. He's now talking with Tracy, the new president of the American Diabetes Association. So it's going all the way to the top. And I think it's just a stigma of, high fat or high protein even. There's, people perceive a danger there on kidney function and atherogenic effects of the high fat. But I think opinions are changing as the science advances. Opinions are going to change. And it might not be for everybody, but I think in the context of diabetes, it's super important, probably more important than any other therapeutic approach.
Yeah, I mean that's a truly fascinating thing. Let me go back to what we talked about at the beginning. Somebody was asking about muscle sparing effects of ketones. We've had people, ketogenic bodybuilders. There's people out there that say that doesn't occur. Can you comment on do ketones have a muscle sparing effect in any way?
Yeah, the student I was just talking to, his PhD dissertation was actually studying the anti-cachexia, the anti-catabolic effects of ketone bodies. And we've published reviews with Brendan Egan, who's a big exercise physiologist in Dublin, Ireland. And the study that he did was looking at, Andrew's study was looking at a mouse model of systemic metastatic cancer that triggers super rapid muscle wasting and cachexia, which is, muscle wasting. And in that context, the ketone bodies were functioning as an anti-catabolic molecule. And it was doing that through a number of different ways. It was reducing levels of alanine in the blood. So when you become catabolic, you have breakdown of proteolytic gluconeogenic amino acids from skeletal muscle. You have proteolytic enzymes that basically break down and chew up your skeletal muscle. That gets released into the bloodstream like alanine, and then you make glucose out of it to preserve your glucose. So your body is kind of starved of energy. So the ketones inhibit that. It reduces lactate. It has direct anti-catabolic effects on different catabolic pathways. In the context of low insulin, it has, by functioning as an alternative energy substrate, the body becomes less hungry for glucose. So we'll seek out, it will attenuate, pathways to break down skeletal muscle to preserve that glucose level. So people have already established that it was anti-catabolic, and that's why humans could fast, for example, 40 days. There was even a study where, a case report where a guy that was 500 pounds fasted for over a year. And So the reason that we can do that is that, when we start fasting, we liberate fatty acids from adipose for energy, but those fatty acids don't cross the blood-brain barrier, but the liver chops them up like a wood chipper and makes long chain fats into water soluble fat molecules we call ketone bodies. And then these ketones can energize and preserve the heart and the brain. And in that context, in that particular context, the ketones really replacing glucose as the primary energy source, they impart a very anti-catabolic effect. So they help to preserve skeletal muscle wasting in a fasted state. And you can probably extrapolate that to muscle wasting states as it pertains to different neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, of course, but also age-related sarcopenia. We think that ketones may reverse some of the anabolic resistance associated with age-related sarcopenia.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. No, I've on social media, I know you're using a CGM and you're doing a lot of, N=1 experiments, different foods, different exercise protocols. Is there any surprising things to you? I'm kind of interested in exercise because I know, like I said, I know for me, when I train really, really hard, like when I'm sprinting, I see my blood glucose go up pretty significantly.
Yeah.
And, and then obviously conversely, when I'm doing just walking and moderate intensity stuff, it goes down. But have you found anything like this kind of interesting stuff? And I know you said you're testing insulin as well, which obviously, I don't know what kind of device you have. Obviously, there's a lot of people who like access to that. But talk about the CGM experiments, what you're learning, and maybe even throw some of that insulin information in there.
Yeah, sure. I use, I think I have to replace my sensor today, but I've been using, we'll probably start using the Dexcom, but I use the Abbott Freestyle Libre CGM. It's on the back, and I use the Levels Health software. So, there's NutriSense, and that was one of the first one I used. And then I started using Levels Health, and that software program will take your CGM and through 12 to 15 different metrics, it gives you a metabolic score. And that metabolic score is comprised of rate of rise, area under the curve, and there's a complexity analysis that goes into measuring that CGM profile that will give you insight into your metabolic health optimization, I guess, if you will. And I really think that glucose is probably the most important biomarker that we need to be measuring, and to measure it in a closed loop system where we have full, understanding of how the temporal and spatial relationship of the curve, especially like when we go to sleep, that's an interesting thing too. Some people's glucose rise when they go to sleep. So CGM has given me a lot of insight into how nutrition affects this important biomarker. And probably the most important thing is that I thought my glucose would skyrocket if I ate like 2 pounds of meat. And it really didn't. And this was, some people told me this that were already doing it, but I had a kind of a lower protein diet when I was following a ketogenic diet for many years. And only since I've been using a CGM did I see that protein really has a minimal effect, at least on me. And it could be different, with maybe someone who has type 2 diabetes. But some of the translatable, actionable things I think that I've learned is that if I eat, after I eat a meal, if I go for a short walk and take the dogs for a walk around the property, it could just be 10, 15 minutes. That significantly reduces that postprandial rise in glucose. And I think, just a very simple thing to do. There's a very low threshold to knock down that spike. It just has to be 10, 15 minutes of walking. The order in which I eat my food, and I know the carnivore community is kind of opposed to eating vegetables, but what I find is that if I eat a salad and throw a lot of fat on a salad. Now, I don't eat a whole lot of vegetables now, but it's more like a garnish. And some days I go, a couple of days without eating any vegetables, just meat. But I do notice that if I have salad, if I have some form of fiber, insoluble fiber especially, and throw a lot of fat on that, and then eat my protein, I get a smaller bump in my CGM. Of course, I think when it comes to fiber, and fiber gets overrated, fiber is not necessary. I do perfectly fine. Sometimes I do better, on zero fiber. But I think fiber is most important if you have carbohydrates in your diet. So, if you're eating, and another test that I did was eating a salad with a lot of olive oil and maybe some, put some feta cheese on it. And then I ate a sweet potato, and that significantly knocked down my glycemic response. But if you're not spiking your glucose with carbohydrates, I think fiber becomes less important, actually. So protein it doesn't really give much of a spike, but I do notice a small decrease in that spike if I do have a salad. It doesn't even have to be a big salad. It could just be a small bowl. And usually I was using vegetables as a carrier for fat. So one way to get like more fat in the diet, kind of drench it with an MCT olive oil based salad dressing. And so the order in which you eat your food is important. And post meal, activity can really knock down your CGM. Eating at nighttime can increase. If I eat a lot of food at nighttime, not only does it disrupt my sleep, but I have a greater dawn effect. So the dawn effect is when you wake up and your glucose starts to rise. But I'm a nighttime snacker, and I think I always will be. And if I don't do it, I'm not as happy as a person. So I continue to snack at night, but I have like Rebel ice cream I had last night, Killer Creamer ice cream, where I mix like a keto mousse thing where I just throw some blueberries, sour cream. I know that sounds weird, but some stevia and cinnamon and stir it up. And, I'll eat that with some chocolate, cocoa powder, like Dutch chocolate powder in it. So these are the things that I learned. Another thing I noticed that if one day I had like 3 or 4 hours of sleep, I think I had like a grant deadline, the next day my CGM was like a different person. And I think it altered my hormones in a way. So I noticed that. So the next time that happened, I had disrupted sleep. I usually sleep really well. And that's one of the benefits of a ketogenic diet or carnivore diet. I think since your glucose variability is more controlled, I think that translates to better sleep. But when I had a disrupted sleep, I have a kits at home where I can measure my hormones. So I measured diurnal salivary cortisol, and getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep shoots my cortisol above, outside the normal range. And that was that I determined that to be experimentally myself, to determine that was a significant contributor to that dawn effect and the wacky glycemic variability I would have throughout the day. But typically when I have a disrupted sleep, the next night I make up for it and I have more deep sleep and more REM sleep. So I usually correct for sleep disruption pretty quick. But these are some of the insights that I got using CGM.
Yeah, one of the, I think it's not controversial. We see that, protein seems to cause a rise in glucose, but it's delayed, 3, 4, 5 hours in. Fat seems to delay that even longer. Obviously that's, I think that attenuates that spike. So you may have, some people say the area under the curve may be similar, but you don't have that big glycemic variability with the big spikes, ups and downs. I know there's studies out there looking at protein, and they say isolated protein until you get to about 75 grams in isolation won't cause any glucose rise. So it'd be interesting. And I don't know what your thoughts are on like whey protein. Whey protein, I think, has a different sort of kinematics, I suppose, in the way way it drives up the glucose. It almost acts like glucose in from what I see, because that's so rapidly absorbed. Have you played with protein isolates, whey proteins on an empty stomach and seen what that does?
Yeah. So if I have 30 grams of like a Gatorade and I have 30 grams of whey protein, the rise in glucose is about 30 or 40% of the 30 grams of glucose. The rise, if I have whey protein, the rise in the blood glucose. It comes down pretty quick. And what I typically experience is a rise in glucose, well above what I would get with meat, right? Whey protein. But I get a postprandial hypoglycemia about 60 to 90 minutes after. And that could be due to the insulin releasing effects of maybe amino acids like leucine or branched chain amino acids. So, but if I take the whey and I combine it with fat, like MCT powder, there's a product that I use called Keto Meal. I think it's made by Ketologic, and it has like whey. It might have a little bit of casein in it, but I think mostly whey. And I drink that, then it's like a very little rise, maybe like a 10 milligrams per deciliter or something like that. So just adding fat to a whey. I mean, if you can get 50% of the calories from fat, that'll knock down that spike pretty significantly. And I think you won't get the fluctuations in blood glucose that could translate to just feeling a little bit, lightheaded and things like that. I think it completely attenuates that or even abolishes that.
Yeah, I think one of the things with the nighttime stuff, I think because if you eat, say, a big steak and then, at 7 p.m. and then you go to sleep, you're going to see, I think these, as this stuff slowly transits through the gut, because we know the, gut transit time slows down tremendously because the body just says, hey, I got a big bolus of fat and protein. I don't want to waste it. So we slow down transport and we just kind of see this slow, steady release. What are your thoughts? There's a lot of, I guess, talk about the microbiome, fiber, and butyrate being essential for the health of the colonocyte, the colonic mucus barrier. But my understanding is there's something called beta-hydroxybutyrate, which I'm sure you're well aware of, which reversely can turn back and forth to butyrate. And maybe some of the effects are basically from beta-hydroxybutyrate. Do you have any thought on that? Can you get the beneficial effects of butyrate without consuming fiber and protect the colon through say, a ketogenic diet, perhaps?
Yeah, so the colonocytes actually use this. I teach this to the medical students. I teach medical physiology and I teach the whole GI section. And we teach that butyrate is the preferred fuel for the colonocytes. So short chain fatty acids will be broken down to, or fiber rather, will be broken down to short chain fatty acids, butyrate being one of them. And butyrate's is a fuel for the colonocytes, and it gets into the bloodstream and actually has epigenetic effects, much like beta-hydroxybutyrate. So the question is can beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body that your liver can make in really high amounts and millimolar concentrations into the blood? I think you can get many of the benefits from beta-hydroxybutyrate, but that tends to be absorbed before it gets to the colon. So I guess maybe what you're getting at is it important? Is it necessary? No. Is it optimal? And is it beneficial to have fiber in the diet to make this butyrate in the colon, right? To help feed and preserve the gut microbiome. And maybe even get butyrate in our blood, because some of it will be used, a lot of it will be used by the colonocytes, but it also gets into the blood and has some beneficial effects. I don't think so. I think the body can probably do perfectly fine without any fiber and without that butyrate being made from the breakdown of fiber and into the short chain fatty acids. We tend to teach that in the medical school, that it's so important to get fiber to make the short chain fatty acids for the colonocytes. And, I don't know, so I was interested in like the medical texts will say this, but there's not the references. So when I dig into these texts, there's not a whole lot of studies that show that it's absolutely necessary for one thing, and that it's beneficial, in the long term, or that it's detrimental if it's not. Is that maybe the question that you're getting at, is like from a butyrate perspective?
Well, I mean, the colonocytes are not like cartilage cells. I mean, they have a blood supply, and so they're going to be getting the circulating beta-hydroxybutyrate is going to reach those colonocytes, and whether it has a beneficial effect. And then the other thing is, we also know that like protein, propionate, acetate, isobutyrate can all be generated, in the colon from protein, which may get there into some degree. Although interesting, plant protein seems to be more present in the colon than animal-based protein because it's so well bioavailable and digestible. So you end up with more plant-based protein in the colon, potentially causing these cadaverines and putrescines and some of these other supposedly toxic compounds, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Somebody was asking about this, wanted you to touch more on the elevations in LDL cholesterol, lean mass hyperresponder. I'm sure you're probably familiar with Dave Feldman's discussion on that. Do you, again, I think you pointed out that there does not seem to be a risk for increased atherogenicity. I know that I think maybe even Verta did that. They looked at carotid intermediate thickness testing on some of their cohort, and they did not see an increase in that. So, do you think we're going to find out that, hey, there's a sub cohort of people that, if they're in a ketogenic diet, low inflammatory state, good glycemic control, higher LDL is perhaps not the problem?
Yeah, there was one study, I think by an Italian group, that that looked at carotid distensibility and with a ketogenic diet, and in a population of people, I believe, with epilepsy, it reduced that distensibility. But these are like the classical ketogenic diets, so that sort of caused a little bit of concern, and it's brought up at conferences on ketogenic diets as a potential. But I think you have long-term data on these people following it for, decades. And we're not seeing any overt signs of atherogenic effects. And then the LDL issue, you do have these, the lean mass hyper responders, I guess they call it. And in the mainstream, ketogenic diet community, when we talk about, clinical application, it's sort of acknowledged that LDL is something that needs to be tracked, but it usually comes back down after about 3 to 6 months, and sometimes it comes back down in like 6 weeks. But on patients, when you track them for a period of time, and a lot of times maybe you get knee-jerk reaction of people who jump on a ketogenic diet and then it spikes up really high and they report it, but then they're not following it months later, and they're just not sticking with the ketogenic diet long enough to where those adaptations are, promote the normalization of that LDL. I think it might be prudent to address that by shifting, away from more saturated fat, primarily from dairy fat, and getting more monounsaturated fat. But I don't think it's not the issue that a lot of people make it out to be. And I'm cautiously optimistic that it's not a major factor if other biomarkers are going in the right direction. If insulin goes down, glycemic control is better, high sensitivity C-reactive protein tends to come down, triglycerides come down. If triglycerides go up and stay up in someone on a ketogenic diet, I think that could be a sign that the ketogenic diet is not for that person. So we all have different levels of fatty acid oxidation enzymes. And for some people, they just don't metabolize, break down, and utilize fat. Their tissues are not as hungry for fat as other people, and for genetic reasons. And I think that in that context, if someone's triglycerides dramatically go up and stay up and don't come back down, I think that's a sign that maybe, high fat diet's not for that person, but maybe they back off on the fat, and maybe they do well on a high protein diet, moderate fat, low carb. They could try that approach instead of a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, there does seem to be, in my experience within this carnivore community of thousands of people now, there's some that thrive on a higher fat approach, some do better on a higher protein approach. Fatty liver is something that is obviously ubiquitous now. Have you seen a lot of data that shows that ketogenic diets can help with that? I know I've read several studies. It seems to be in the context of either calorically restricted diets or certainly not hyper, because there's a lot of hypercaloric overfeeding studies that show saturated fat will lead to fatty liver in some cases. Again, that's context dependent. What's been your thought on, or do you look much into fatty liver?
Yeah, so actually I'm working on an IRB protocol right now that with a Dr. Carter in Florida here. And he approached me years ago, and he had been using a lot of different medications to treat non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and then became aware of low carb diets and ketogenic diets. And then maybe 5 years or so ago, he reached out to me and said, I want you to talk. He's the chair of the alumni committee for the medical school, and said, I think you should give a talk to the medical doctors here and make them aware of the ketogenic diet and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And I said, I don't really study that. I was like, this is interesting. So I started reading up more, and he is an interventional radiologist and was basically observing remarkable reversal of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, not through drugs, which he was trying, but through low carb diets, in particular ketogenic diets. So we are setting up a study now with the Florida Medical Clinic to do these CT scans, carotid CT, and also the liver. We get people that are sort of, they just want to, they're not overtly obese or type 2 diabetic, but they just want to, optimize their metabolism. And they go through this 12-week wellness program, Dr. Allison Hull here at Florida Medical Clinic. And the interventional radiologists, I think, are, and there's also groups that do non-human primate studies that they do like a liver biopsy. They actually take a liver punch and show, dramatic caloric restriction, obviously one. It's possible the ketogenic diet and low carb diets are working inadvertently, not through macronutrient changing that, but just through caloric restriction. But nonetheless, so the doctors that I talked to that were not really fans of the ketogenic diet, reached out to me and said, this diet is remarkably effective for reversing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is really scary. I mean, it's kind of becoming ubiquitous, and something in the environment, in our food system, something is causing this, and it's going to be a major problem. There's going to be a huge need for liver transplants for people. And I think, I can't think of any other way. You talk to these interventional radiologists who don't even study diets, and they'll tell you their patients that do low carb and that do ketogenic diets, they have remarkable reversal of this.
Yeah, I was going to say there's going to be a need for a lot of liver transplant patients and a lot of blood bank. At least, maybe they've gotten better at saving blood, but it used to be a
really bad procedure. I didn't know how bad it was until I talked to the investigators.
Yeah, it's a tough deal. But one last topic, Dom. So cancer. I know you had just kind of talked about. I know there's Thomas Seyfried was talking about ketogenic diets, press pulse therapy, hyperbaric oxygen chambers. Are you still involved in that much? And what has transpired in the last, say, 5 years since I think I've been aware of you talking about that? Any more news about cancer on that front?
Oh yeah, I'm super active. About half of what I do actually is cancer research. We work closely with the Moffitt Cancer Center here, and my primary interest in cancer was for brain cancer because patients are put on high doses of anti-epileptic drugs. And I was studying seizures, and I was like, I know patients took dexamethasone, and really they're using it as an anti-seizure because it reduced inflammation and a mixture of other drugs. And I had talked to some patients. I was like, the ketogenic diet works. And then I just searched like ketogenic diet and brain tumor. And then it came up, Tom Seyfried's work came up, a 2008 paper that the diet actually targets the cancer metabolism, the Warburg effect. So that got me super interested. And I read his review article, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, their early article. And then I had a student come into my lab, my first PhD student, Dr. Angela Poff, she's a doctor now. She wanted to study this. So I searched and found the most aggressive cancer model on the planet, which was a VMDK model of advanced metastatic cancer. And I was told, if you can move the needle on this and slowing and tumor growth, you got something pretty impressive. So we got these mice, we bred them up, we implanted the cancer cells that spread through all the organs, and we put them on a standard diet, and we put them on a ketogenic diet, and I would go in every day, and the mice were dying quick off the standard diet. And then after 50% of the mice were dead on the standard diet, all of the mice on the ketogenic diet were alive. And that was our little pilot study. And I told my student, Angela, I was like, okay, we're going to make this your PhD project. So after that, we've done dozens of studies. Now we have breast cancer model, lung cancer model, metastatic cancer model, brain tumor models. In animal models, it's remarkably effective. And at this time, if you went to clinicaltrials.gov, there was one, maybe two, on clinicaltrials.gov. And now if you go there and search, cancer and ketogenic diet, you'll find probably about 40 clinical trials. And I think more than half of them are recruiting. And I'm a consultant and Cedars-Sinai looking at GBM, brain tumor. So my focus is really on brain tumors because the diet has a dual effect at preventing seizures associated with the brain tumor, but also targeting, brain energy. It's reducing neuroinflammation, which is driving tumor growth and invasiveness. Although I'm working with investigators studying, all sorts of cancers, my real passion is just glioblastoma is the deadliest form of cancer, and people do not survive it. So I want to go for the most aggressive cancer. And if it works in this, then, that's actually going to have major proof for the cancer community to adopt a diet. We study the ketogenic diet in the context of an adjuvant. So we use the diet, and then we do things like hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We do standard of care too. We look at metabolic drugs like metformin. So we're actually looking at putting together like a metabolic therapy that's comprehensive, that uses a combination of things. And the ketogenic diet is sort of like the base, and that can further augment other therapeutic modalities, whether that be chemo, radiation, or cancer-specific metabolic drugs, which we're sort of very interested in too.
Just one last on the animal studies. I mean, there's always this high-fat rat model for inducing diabetes, and I think they're using corn oil or something like that, and maybe even high sugar in there. How do you formulate the diet for these rats on a ketogenic diet when you're doing cancer? Is it still the vegetable oil, or is it a lard-based diet? What do you guys are using? What do you find? Is there a difference in the formulation?
Yeah, good question. Canola oil is really not that bad. It's not as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. But I formulated a diet like 12 years ago that's like 30% of the calories are from MCT. And then it's lard and monounsaturated fats, and actually it's some flax, so you have some polyunsaturated fat. It's a little bit lower in saturated fat because that was my thinking back then. And we call that the KD2 diet, and that's what we used. And it was remarkably effective. And I was like, well, let's not switch it if this works pretty effective. And then with the debate with saturated fat, but I think saturated fat is okay. But if it's like 100% of the fat calories, what I want to do is kind of minimize that. But, MCTs are pure saturated fats too. I mean, so our diet is technically high in saturated fat, but I incorporated some like flax oil and canola oil. And I put together a few different diets where it would be feasible from a dietary perspective, from putting together like a meal plan. Ketogenic diet. So it was a modified ketogenic. It was higher in protein. It was like 20% protein. So I believe the higher protein is important. 20 to 30% protein is best for a cancer patient. They need more. I knew guys like Walter Longo are very adamant about low protein, and we can have a whole nother discussion on that. But I think for a cancer patient, I've communicated with many of them, a low protein diet is going to contribute to that patient succumbing to cachexia. So the higher protein is going to be important.
Yeah, Dom, this has been great. I just want to be respectful of your time. For people that want to follow you, or for people who want to support what you're doing, is there any way they can do that to sort of further what you and some of the other researchers are doing? So how to find you on social media or any other way, and then how to maybe if somebody wanted to support what you're doing, what could they do?
Yeah, I would say go to our website, ketonutrition.org. We also have, what am I wearing today? Ketone Technologies is our company. So I do scientific consulting, and we partner with government organizations. But I think there's links on the Ketone Technologies website to like a 501c3 foundation through the university. And that goes to support my students' research. We have that. And just go to the information website, ketonutrition.org. And we have, I put podcasts on there. There's consulting on there. There's a lot of information. We have a blog, and we hit different topics. So, and we have some products on there too. We don't sell any products, but we like to test products, and the products that we like, I have links on there. Some of them are affiliate links. Some of them aren't, just depending on the company.
Dom, I'd love to keep going, but I'm hungry and I got a couple steaks.
Anyway, and I gotta go teach actually. So
all right, thank you so much. Appreciate it, and good luck to you.
Great talking to you, Shawn.
All right.
Yeah. Hope to connect soon again. Okay.
Right, see you later, guys. Bye-bye. Bye.